Society Must Be Defended, Chapter 11:17, Biopower, by Foucault. It seems to me that one of the basic phenomena of the 19th century, 1800s, was what might be called power's hold over life. What I mean is the acquisition of power over man, insofar as man is a living being, that the biological came under state control, that there was at least a certain tendency that leads to what might be termed state control of the biological. And I think that in order to understand what was going on, it helps if we refer to what used to be the classical theory of sovereignty, which ultimately provided us with the backdrop to, a picture of, all these analyses of war, races, and so on. You know that in the classical theory of sovereignty, the right of life and death was one of sovereignty's basic attributes. Now the right of life and death is a strange right. Even at the theoretical level, it is a strange right. What does having the right of life and death actually mean? In one sense, to say that the sovereign has a right of life and death means that he can, basically, either have people put to death or let them live, or in any case, that life and death are not natural or immediate phenomena, which are primal or radical, and which fall outside the field of power. If we take the argument a little further, or to the point where it becomes paradoxical, it means that in terms of his relationship with the sovereign, the subject is, by rights, neither dead nor alive. From the point of view of life and death, the subject is neutral, and it is thanks to the sovereign that the subject has the right to be alive, or possibly the right to be dead. In any case, the lives and deaths of subjects become rights only as a result of the will of the sovereign. That is, if you like, the theoretical paradox. And it is, of course, a theoretical paradox that must have as its corollary a sort of practical disequilibrium. What does the right of life and death actually mean? Obviously not that the sovereign can grant life in the same way that he can inflict death. The right of life and death is always exercised in an unbalanced way. The balance is always tipped in favor of death. Sovereign's power effect on life is exercised only when the sovereign can kill. The very essence of the right of life and death is actually the right to kill. It is at the moment when the sovereign can kill that he exercises his right over life. It is essentially the right of the sword. So there is no real symmetry in the right over life and death. It is not the right to put people to death or to grant them life, nor is it the right to allow people to live or to leave them to die. It is the right to take life or let live, and this obviously introduces a startling dissymmetry. And I think one of the greatest transformations political right underwent in the 19th century, 1800s, was precisely that. I wouldn't say exactly that sovereignty's old right to take life or let live was replaced, but it came to be complemented by a new right, which does not erase the old right, but which does penetrate it, permeate it. This is the right, or rather precisely the opposite right. It is the power to make live and let die. The right of sovereignty was the right to take life or let live, and then this new right is established, the right to make live and to let die. This transformation obviously did not occur all at once. We can trace it in the theory of right, but here I will be extraordinarily rapid. The jurists of the 17th, 1600s, and especially the 18th, 1700s century were, you see, already asking this question about the right of life and death. The jurists ask, when we enter into a contract, what are individuals doing at the level of the social contract when they come together to constitute a sovereign, to delegate absolute power over them to a sovereign? They do so because they are forced to by some threat or by need. They therefore do so in order to protect their lives. It is in order to live that they constitute a sovereign. To the extent that this is the case, can life actually become one of the rights of the sovereign? Isn't life the foundation of the sovereign's right, and can the sovereign actually demand that his subjects grant him the right to exercise the power of life and death over them, or in other words, simply the power to kill them? Mustn't life remain outside the contract to the extent that it was the first, initial, and foundational reason for the contract itself? All this is a debate within political philosophy that we can leave on one side, but it clearly demonstrates how the problem of life began to be problematized in the field of political thought, of the analysis of political power. I would in fact like to trace the transformation not at the level of political theory, but rather at the level of the mechanisms, techniques, and technologies of power. And this brings us back to something familiar. In the 17th, 1600s, and 18th, 1700s centuries, we saw the emergence of techniques of power that were essentially centered on the body, on the individual body. They included all devices that were used to ensure the spatial distribution of individual bodies, their separation, their alignment, their serialization, and their surveillance, and the organization around those individuals of a whole field of visibility. They were also techniques that could be used to take control over bodies. Attempts were made to increase their productive force through exercise, drill, and so on. They were also techniques for rationalizing and strictly economizing on a power that had to be used in the least costly way possible, thanks to a whole system of surveillance, hierarchies, inspections, bookkeeping, and reports. All the technology that can be described as the disciplinary technology of labor. It was established at the end of the 17th century, 1600s, and in the course of the 18th, 1700s. Now I think we see something new emerging in the second half of the 18th century, 1700s, a new technology of power, but this time it is not disciplinary. This technology of power does not exclude the former, does not exclude disciplinary technology, but it does dovetail into it, integrate it, modify it to some extent, and above all, use it by sort of infiltrating it, embedding itself in existing disciplinary techniques. This new technique does not simply do away with the disciplinary technique because it exists at a different level, on a different scale, and because it has a different bearing area and makes use of very different instruments. Unlike discipline, which is addressed to bodies, the new non-disciplinary power is applied not to man as body, but to the living man, to man as living being, ultimately, if you like, to man as species. To be more specific, I would say that discipline tries to rule a multiplicity of men to the extent that their multiplicity can and must be dissolved into individual bodies that can be kept under surveillance, trained, used, and, if need be, punished. And that new technology that is being established is addressed to a multiplicity of men, not to the extent that they are nothing more than their individual bodies, but to the extent that they form, on the contrary, a global mass that is affected by overall processes characteristic of birth, death, production, illness, and so on. So after a first seizure of power over the body in an individualizing mode, we have a second seizure of power that is not individualizing but, if you like, massifying, that is directed not at man as body, but at man as species. After the anatomopolitics of the human body established in the course of the 18th century, 1700s, we have, at the end of that century, the emergence of something that is no longer an anatomopolitics of the human body, but what I would call a biopolitics of the human race. What does this new technology of power, this biopolitics, this biopower that is beginning to establish itself, involve? I told you very briefly a moment ago, a set of processes such as the ratio of births to deaths, the rate of reproduction, the fertility of a population, and so on. It is these processes, the birth rate, the mortality rate, longevity, and so on, together with a whole series of related economic and political problems, which I will not come back to for the moment, which, in the second half of the 18th century, 1700s, become biopolitics' first objects of knowledge and the targets it seeks to control. It is at any rate at this moment that the first demographers begin to measure these phenomena in statistical terms. They begin to observe the more or less spontaneous, more or less compulsory techniques that the population actually used to control the birth rate, in a word if you like, to identify the phenomena of birth control practices in the 18th century, 1700s. We also see the beginnings of a natalist policy, plans to intervene in all phenomena relating to the birth rate. This biopolitics is not concerned with fertility alone. It also deals with the problem of morbidity, but not simply, as had previously been the case, at the level of the famous epidemics, the threat of which had haunted political powers ever since the early Middle Ages. These famous epidemics were temporary disasters that caused multiple deaths, times when everyone seemed to be in danger of imminent death. At the end of the 18th century, 1700s, it was not epidemics that were the issue, but something else, what might broadly be called endemics, or in other words, the form, nature, extension, duration, and intensity of the illnesses prevalent in a population. These were illnesses that were difficult to eradicate and that were not regarded as epidemics that caused more frequent deaths, but as permanent factors which, and that is how they were dealt with, sapped the population's strength, shortened the working week, wasted energy, and cost money, both because they led to a fall in production and because treating them was expensive. In a word, illness as phenomena affecting a population. Death was no longer something that suddenly swooped down on life, as in an epidemic. Death was now something permanent, something that slips into life, perpetually gnaws at it, diminishes it, and weakens it. These are the phenomena that begin to be taken into account at the end of the 18th century, 1700s, and they result in the development of a medicine whose main function will now be public hygiene, with institutions to coordinate medical care, centralize information, and normalize knowledge, and which also takes the form of campaigns to teach hygiene and to medicalize the population. So problems of reproduction, the birth rate, and the problem of the mortality rate too. Biopolitics' other field of intervention will be a set of phenomena, some of which are universal, and some of which are accidental, but which can never be completely eradicated, even if they are accidental. They have similar effects in that they incapacitate individuals, put them out of the circuit, or neutralize them. This is the problem, and it will become very important in the early 19th century, 1800s, the time of industrialization, of old age, of individuals who, because of their age, fall out of the field of capacity, of activity. The field of biopolitics also includes accidents, infirmities, and various anomalies, and it is in order to deal with these phenomena that this biopolitics will establish not only charitable institutions, which had been in existence for a very long time, but also much more subtle mechanisms that were much more economically rational than an indiscriminate charity, which was at once widespread and patchy, and which was essentially under church control. We see the introduction of more subtle, more rational mechanisms, insurance, individual and collective savings, safety measures, and so on. Biopolitics' last domain is, finally, I am enumerating the main ones, or at least those that appeared in the late 18th, 1700s, and early 19th, 1800s centuries. Many others would appear later. Control over relations between the human race, or human beings insofar as they are a species, insofar as they are living beings, and their environment, the milieu in which they live. This includes the direct effects of the geographical, climatic, or hydrographic environment, the problem, for instance, of swamps and of epidemics linked to the existence of swamps throughout the first half of the 19th century, 1800s, and also the problem of the environment to the extent that it is not a natural environment, that it has been created by the population and therefore has effects on that population. This is essentially the urban problem. I am simply pointing out some of biopolitics' starting points, some of its practices, and the first of its domains of intervention, knowledge, and power. Biopolitics will derive its knowledge from and define its powers field of intervention in terms of the birth rate, the mortality rate, various biological disabilities, and the effects of the environment. In all this, a number of things are, I think, important. The first appears to be this: the appearance of a new element, I almost said a new character, of which both the theory of right and disciplinary practice knew nothing. The theory of right basically knew only the individual and society, the contracting individual and the social body constituted by the voluntary or implicit contract among individuals. Disciplines, for their part, dealt with individuals and their bodies in practical terms. What we are dealing with in this new technology of power is not exactly society, or at least not the social body, as defined by the jurist, nor is it the individual as body. It is a new body, a multiple body, a body with so many heads that, while they might not be infinite in number, cannot necessarily be counted. Biopolitics deals with the population as political problem, as a problem that is at once scientific and political, as a biological problem, and as powers problem. And I think that biopolitics emerges at this time. Second, the other important thing, quite aside from the appearance of the population element itself, is the nature of the phenomena that are taken into consideration. You can see that they are collective phenomena which have their economic and political effects, and that they become pertinent only at the mass level, They are phenomena that are aleatory and unpredictable when taken in themselves or individually, but which, at the collective level, display constants that are easy, or at least possible, to establish. And they are, finally, phenomena that occur over a period of time, which have to be studied over a certain period of time. They are serial phenomena. The phenomena addressed by biopolitics are, essentially, aleatory events that occur within a population that exists over a period of time. On this basis, and this is, I think, the third important point, this technology of power, this biopolitics, will introduce mechanisms with a certain number of functions that are very different from the functions of disciplinary mechanisms. The mechanisms introduced by biopolitics include forecasts, statistical estimates, and overall measures, and their purpose is not to modify any given phenomena as such, or to modify a given individual insofar as he is an individual, but essentially to intervene at the level of which these general phenomena are determined, to intervene at the level of their generality. The mortality rate has to be modified or lowered, life expectancy has to be increased, the birth rate has to be stimulated, and most important of all, regulatory mechanisms must be established to establish an equilibrium, maintain an average, establish a sort of homeostasis, and compensate for variations within this general population and its aleatory field. In a word, security mechanisms have to be installed around the random element inherent in a population of living beings so as to optimize a state of life. Like disciplinary mechanisms, these mechanisms are designed to maximize and extract forces, but they work in very different ways. Unlike disciplines, they no longer train individuals by working at the level of the body itself. There is absolutely no question relating to an individual body in the way that discipline does. It is therefore not a matter of taking the individual at the level of individuality, but, on the contrary, of using overall mechanisms and acting in such a way as to achieve overall states of equilibrium or regularity. It is, in a word, a matter of taking control of life and the biological processes of man as species, and of ensuring that they are not disciplined, but regularized. Beneath that great absolute power, beneath the dramatic and sober absolute power that was the power of sovereignty, and which consisted in the power to take life, we now have the emergence, with this technology of biopower, of this technology of power over the population as such, over men insofar as they are living beings. It is continuous, scientific, and it is the power to make live. Sovereignty took life and let live, and now we have the emergence of a power that I would call the power of regularization, and it, in contrast, consists in making live and letting die. I think that we can see a concrete manifestation of this power in the famous gradual disqualification of death, which sociologists and historians have discussed so often. Everyone knows, thanks in particular to a certain number of recent studies, that the great public ritualization of death gradually began to disappear, or at least to fade away, in the late 18th, 1700s century, and that it is still doing so today. So much so that death, which has ceased to be one of those spectacular ceremonies in which individuals, the family, the group, and practically the whole of society took part, has become, in contrast, something to be hidden away. It has become the most private and shameful thing of all, and ultimately, it is now not so much sex as death that is the object of a taboo. Now, I think that the reason why death had become something to be hidden away is not that anxiety has somehow been displaced, or that repressive mechanisms have been modified. What once, and until the end of the 18th century, 1700s, made death so spectacular and ritualized it so much was the fact that it was a manifestation of a transition from one power to another. Death was the moment when we made the transition from one power, that of the sovereign of this world, to another, that of the sovereign of the next world. We went from one court of law to another, from a civil or public right over life and death, to a right to either eternal life or eternal damnation, a transition from one power to another. Death also meant the transmission of the power of the dying, and that power was transmitted to those who survived him. Last words, last recommendations, last wills and testaments, and so on. All these phenomena of power were ritualized. Now that power is decreasingly the power of the right to take life, and increasingly the right to intervene to make live, or once power begins to intervene mainly at this level in order to improve life by eliminating accidents, the random element, and deficiencies, death becomes, insofar as it is the end of life, the term, the limit, or the end of power too. Death is outside the power relationship. Death is beyond the reach of power, and power has a grip on it only in general, overall, or statistical terms. Power has no control over death, but it can control mortality, and to that extent, it is only natural that death should now be privatized and should become the most private thing of all. In the right of sovereignty, death was the moment of the most obvious and most spectacular manifestation of the absolute power of the sovereign. Death now becomes, in contrast, the moment when the individual escapes all power, falls back on himself and retreats, so to speak, into his own privacy. Power no longer recognizes death. Power literally ignores death.